Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. For those of you who know me or have been listening for a while, you might know that I'm a little bit of a sports fan, and specifically a women's sports fan, but I really just do love all sports. And in particular, I am mildly obsessed with the Olympics. When the last Summer Olympics were on in Paris, I did a whole podcast episode about lessons that dance could learn from the Olympics. I will link that in the show notes if you're interested. But today, I wanted to chat about something a little bit different. If you followed the recent Winter Olympics at all, I am sure you are aware of the story of the downhill ski racer Lindsey Vonn and her injury saga and her unfortunate crash at the games, and we're going to get into that a little bit. In light of that, there have been a lot of conversations that have been happening through my DMs, but especially in the clinic, of people with varying opinions on the matter in terms of whether she should have participated, if it was safe for her to participate, all of the things. And full disclaimer, I know nothing personally about her injury other than what has been shared in the media. So this is by no means going to be me digging into her exact injury, but it has opened up really interesting conversations around the decision-making involved, or how do we decide when it is maybe worth it, and I use that in quotation marks, or appropriate for an athlete, or in this case, a dancer, to potentially perform when dealing with an injury, versus when do we absolutely need to not let that happen. And this has just been a high-profile instance of an athlete performing with an injury because of the Olympics and the visibility and the media and that world stage. But there's been other examples as well. One of the other recent ones that comes to mind, and like I said, I'm a women's sports fan and I follow a lot of women's soccer. And over the summer, there was the Women's Euros tournament in Europe. For those of you in North America who are not aware, it's kind of like the World Cup, but just for European countries. And it often serves as a qualifier for the next subsequent World Cup and things like that. But it's a big tournament, huge bragging rights. And it came out after the tournament. So England won this year. They were repeat champions. And it came out after the tournament that one of the English players, Lucy Bronze, had been playing the tournament on a broken leg. She had a fracture to her tibia. And I've heard a couple of interviews with her afterwards. And again, she's kind of gotten into some of those decision-making processes. So this is something that happens in elite sport probably more often than the general public is aware of. And it is not just athletes necessarily going out there and competing with, no medical input or defying medical orders or anything like that. There are specific decisions that are being made around the safety and appropriateness of these athletes who are competing. So, like I said, I want to kind of bring this back and reframe it for the dance world, because this is something that happens in the clinic often when we have to make decisions about whether a dancer is able to perform and if they are dealing with or recovering from an injury. And when I say perform, I'm kind of throwing everything into the same category. But this could be a performance. This could be a competition. This could be an exam. This is something that is an event in dance. So it's not necessarily just a show when I say perform or a performance. I am encompassing all of those things like competition and all of that kind of stuff as well. So what I want to do today is just go through some of the things that are taken into consideration. And this is not an exhaustive list. And the decision-making questions or things to consider are going to be different in a different sport or with a specific athlete. So this, like I said, is not an exhaustive list, but these were just some of the first things that popped into my mind when we are making decisions about whether we are going to advise a dancer to potentially perform when dealing with an injury, or if we're going to say, no, we actually need to put the brakes on that and we need to like withdraw from that opportunity. So like I said, I will probably use Lindsey Vohn's injury as like a little bit of a reference point because the general public is aware of it right now. And there's been a lot of armchair experts with all sorts of opinions online. So I may use it as a bit of a reference, but like I said, I have no insider knowledge of, her specific injury, her medical team, anything like that. It is just an easy reference point because people are aware of it right now. So thing number one, and these are actually in no particular order. So this is not like an order of importance or anything like that. This is just like random things. So number one, what is the importance of the event? And I know that people will come at me and say that that should not matter. But the reality is it absolutely does matter. And for an athlete like Lindsey Vonn, this is very likely, regardless of injury or not, this was very likely going to be her last Olympic Games. If you don't know her story, she retired a number of years ago and came out of retirement at age 40 and has joined the World Cup circuit again and, rejoined and has won some of the World Cup events. And so she wanted to kind of prove herself at what is likely her very, very last Olympics. And just in general, in the sporting world, when we think about what are like the highest important events, the Olympics are going to rank fairly high up there. And especially because it's an event that only happens once every 4 years. And so in the dance world, again, what is the importance of this event? I will argue that in dance, there are not nearly as many events that would have that same level of like kind of global significance, if you will. Like we do not have the World Cup. We do not have the Olympics, or at least we don't currently with breakdancing not being in the Olympics for this next Olympic cycle. Things like that. But we do have events that maybe hold more importance than others. So maybe we do have a national level competition or even a world's level competition in some genres of dance if we look at the Irish dance world and things like that. And then we might have, a local studio recital as another performance opportunity. So we want to look at the importance of those events because our decision-making is absolutely going to be influenced by how important the event is or that performance opportunity. And like I said, I know there's people who are going to come at me and say that like when it comes to an injury or like health and wellness, that shouldn't play a factor, but it absolutely does play a factor. And this is not for like the medical team to decide the importance of the event necessarily when we are dealing with adults. So Lindsey Vonn, as a adult who has competed at an incredibly high level for her entire career, she has a major say in the importance of the Olympics and what it meant to her. She is an adult. She has the ability to make those decisions. If we're dealing with dancers who are children and minors, then they don't get as much of a say in terms of, determining the importance of an event because they just maybe don't have those same kind of like executive functioning and critical decision-making skills. So as an adult and as a person in authority, more of that falls to us, but we still are going to take into consideration the importance of whatever the event is. Number two, like I said, no particular order. So number two, we are going to consider the potential for worsening of the injury that is being dealt with. And with a lot of different types of injuries, performing on it, at least for a short period of time or maybe a one-off opportunity, may not actually worsen that injury. And in the case of Lindsey Vonn, she had fully ruptured her ACL in her knee. She had no ACL. So the potential for further injuring that ligament or that part of the knee complex was pretty much non-existent. There was nothing left there for her to injure. She already knew that she was already going to be undergoing surgery after the season ended to have an ACL reconstruction. So for her, the potential for further injuring that ACL injury was pretty much non-existent. Now, obviously, we all know now that she had a fairly horrific crash and has another injury, but it actually had nothing to do with the pre-existing injury. She broke her leg in the kind of subsequent crash, And that had a lot to do with her skis not releasing from the bindings. And anyway, I'm not going to get into it. But the actual injury that she was dealing with going into the Olympics had very, very low potential for further damage happening. Other injuries that we have, there could be a lot of potential to further damage or create more structural damage if we continue to perform on that injury. So that is something that we are absolutely going to take into consideration. If it is a question of there being relatively little further damage that is going to happen, and maybe it might prolong the healing of the injury, but it's not going to make the injury worse, that is a different consideration than an injury where there is a very high probability that we could, fully damage something or damage something even further. Again, with the case of Lucy Bronze, the soccer player, she had what she described, and again, this is just from interviews I've heard, but it was a 9 mm fracture to her tibia, which actually was from an impact. So she had been, I think, kicked in the shin or something. But anyway, so there was a specific impact that had caused it. It wasn't a stress reaction or anything like that. And they knew or were very confident that her playing on a very stable, very small fracture in her tibia from being kicked in that spot was unlikely to produce more damage. It was very unlikely for it to become a full fracture or anything like that. So again, the medical team is weighing that into consideration. Are we going to be creating more damage, or is it just going to kind of stay the same and still have to be dealt with after the fact? So that is something that is being taken into consideration. Similar to that, but slightly different, a little bit of a different conversation, is what is the potential for long-term damage or consequences? And so what I mean by that is, are there other repercussions or other sort of fallouts that could happen as a result of continuing to perform on this injury? So in the case of Lindsey Vonn, where she had ruptured her ACL, if she continued to train and perform and compete on that for long periods of time, there is a very high correlation of people missing ACLs and continuing to do high-level sports and activities, and then osteoarthritis in the joint later on in their life. However, in this case, or in her case, she was likely just going to compete at the Olympics and then call it a season and deal with the injury. And so when we think about long-term consequence or long-term damage, racing on a knee with no ACL in it for a race or maybe a few races is unlikely to cause long-term damage versus if somebody is doing it for years at a time. So we need to consider, is there going to be a long-term consequence of performing on this injury? And generally, the longer we perform on an injury, the higher the potential for long-term consequences. But again, it's going to be really injury specific in terms of what those consequences probably are. With some injuries, like I was saying, the consequence might just be that healing might be slightly delayed and take slightly longer, but it may not actually have any more long-term repercussions down the road. So that is something that is going to be taken into consideration. Something else we're going to consider as well is if we're going to perform and not, take time off to rest or to rehab and allow this injury to heal, when is the next opportunity, or when are we going to do that? Because at some point that has to happen. We can't just ignore injuries and continue to perform on them forever and expect that they are going to improve. That is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about managing risk for a specific event or for a specific occurrence. So when is that next opportunity? Is it a case of, okay, there is this one event, i.e. the Olympics, and as soon as the Olympics are done, then I'm going to stop, rest, have surgery, rehab, whatever it is. And again, in the case of dance, is it just one event? Is it one competition? Is it one exam? Is it one thing that we need to get through? And then we know that we can take the appropriate amount of rest or pull back and actually address the injury after. Or is there literally no end in sight, which is very common in the dance world because it's one competition followed by another, and then there's an exam, and then there's a recital, and then there's, another performance, whatever it is. If there is no end in sight, we need to create time and space for recovery and rehabilitation. And so we know at some point that dancer is going to miss out on something. And so again, we start to think about prioritizing, okay, is there one thing that's more important? Is the thing that's coming up immediately the most important thing? Maybe the dancer performs through the injury for that one most important thing, but then we know that they're going to have to take time off. If everything kind of holds equal weight and equal importance, then we want to take that break and really focus on rest and recovery as soon as possible. The longer we try and push through when something's not right, the more we are going to deal with compensation or other types of issues that arise from continuing to try and push the body when it's not 100%. But in some instances, it might make sense to say, okay, we're going to do this one thing, and then we know we have a good opportunity to properly address whatever this issue is. So something else that we look at, that when is the next opportunity to address the actual injury? And then something that I think should probably be a bigger conversation than maybe it sometimes is, and dancers sometimes have a hard time wrapping their head around, is will you, as a dancer, be able to perform at your best? And that kind of comes down to the question, or if we really pare it back, it's almost like, is it worth it? So if we know that the dancer just needs to get through 2.5 minute routine, and we know they're going to be able to do it, and they're going to be able to do it at 100%, that is one consideration versus a dancer who is just convincing themselves that they're maybe okay to keep going, and we know they're not going to be performing at 100%. Maybe they're going to be giving it 60% because that's all they can. Maybe, it's going to be even less than that. And so that is something that dancers need to really consider and be very honest with themselves about, and athletes as well. And I would hazard a guess, and again, I don't know for sure, but I would hazard a guess that Lindsey Vonn did a bunch of training on her injured knee. And I don't mean a ton of training, but she would have had training runs on that injured knee to see where she was at. Was she able to generate speed and power, and did she have control, and was her knee stable enough, and all of those things that her times would have been competitive, because she would not have entered herself or continued to participate in the Olympics and put herself on that platform and in front of a world spotlight if she didn't think that there was a chance that she was still going to be in the running for, podiums or whatever her goals were for that event. She's not going to go out there and just be like, I just need to make it down the hill, but I'm going to be a minute slower than everyone else. That was not what her thinking would have been. And so again, somewhere in her mind, she was convinced from all of the, testing that they did and probably training runs and all of that she was still going to be able to perform at her best, or at least near enough her best that it was good enough for her. And as dancers, I think sometimes we struggle with this a little bit, where we maybe aren't super honest with ourselves about whether we are actually going to be able to perform at our best. And if we're not able to perform at our best, then is it worth it? So is it worth looking at the other, risk assessments if we're going to go out there and only be able to do 50%? Is that what you want to put out in the world? And again, for some dancers, the answer might be yes. I have worked with dancers before who it's their graduating year. They want to perform their grad solo in their year-end recital. There's a lot of meaning and emotion attached to what it is they're doing, and they don't care, or to them, the ability to actually go out and do it is more important than them being able to perform at 100%. They know that maybe they're only going to be at 50 or 60% capacity, but that is then worth it for them. But in most cases, and if we're thinking about competition or whatever, a lot of dancers aren't necessarily going to want to go and put themselves out there when you can't perform at 100% or give it sort of your all necessarily. And so maybe we pull back, and it is a good time to focus on rehab, and then know that when you do go back out there, you can give it 100%. So we want to make sure that we are able to feel like we can perform at our best. So those are, like I said, not an exhaustive list, but just some of the things that we are considering when we are deciding if it's feasible or not feasible for a dancer to be able to perform when they're managing an injury. As far as dance goes, there's also a few other things that are maybe like a bit more dance specific that don't apply to the sport world quite as much. And one of those is that we do, for the most part, have the ability to modify choreography. So this might not apply if you're in an exam situation or you're participating in a style of dance like a competition where there's like set steps and set dances that you have to do. Maybe we can't modify, in which case we don't have as much flexibility. But for a lot of dance, the judges or the audience or the examiner or whoever it is, they don't know what the choreography is supposed to look like. We have the ability to modify based on what our physical capacity is. So I have worked with plenty of dancers who have amazing teachers and studio directors who are more than happy to modify choreography if needed for a dancer to still be able to perform. And so maybe they're managing an injury and it's like they can do almost everything, but there's one little thing that they can't do. And let's say it's, an aerial, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. It's easy enough to take that out, and the judges do not know. A lot of sports don't have that ability. So, in the case of ski racing, it's a time sport. You have to go fast. It doesn't matter what it looks like. There's no modifying it. There's no, modifications that you can make. You have to get down the hill as fast as you possibly can. And similar, like in other sports, there are requirements, or it's just simply based on time, and you just have to perform at your best. So dance is really unique, and one of the reasons I actually really love working in the field is because I feel like we have more ability and we can be a bit more creative in how we get our dancers back performing because of this ability to modify choreography if we need to. So that's just something to consider that maybe doesn't apply to the sports world as much, where it's a bit more black and white. You're not going to, put a player in a soccer game if they're not running. You can't say, oh, well, she can still kick the ball really well, so we'll just have her stand in one spot and the rest of the team can run and she'll just kick. Like, that's not going to be a thing. They have to be able to perform basically at 100% before they're going to be on the pitch. But in dance, we can modify if we need to. So that's one thing just to consider. And then the other thing that I just want to sort of highlight or potentially reiterate is the difference in dealing with adults or professionals versus dealing with kids and adolescents. And so again, if we have professional dancers who are dancing, whether it's contract work or in a company, or even just adult recreational dancers deciding whether they want to perform in a recital or things like that, as long as we are giving them all of the information about all of the other things we just talked about, the potential for the injury to get worse or the potential for long-term damage and consequences and all of those things, at the end of the day, they are an adult and they can make whatever decision they want. And my job is to try and educate them as best I can and hopefully steer them towards what I think is the most responsible thing for them to do. But at the end of the day, an adult is an adult and we only have so much input in those situations. A lot of the dancers that we are working with, and if you're a dance teacher listening, a lot of the students that you are working with are minors. They are children, they are adolescents, they are teens, whatever we want to call them. And we need to be more of the authority when it comes to that. And in some cases, we also have to navigate conflicting priorities between the family as well. So sometimes, and I've seen it both ways, where sometimes I'll have a dancer who says, I cannot perform, and a parent might say, no, they're going to be fine. It'll be fine, and kind of minimizes things. And the dancer is like, I don't think I can do this. And then we also have it the other way where the dancer says, no, like I'm fine. And we've gone through all the risk assessment. And even, potentially me as the healthcare provider is saying, no, like they can perform, like these are, the modifications we're going to make, whatever it is. And the parent or the family may be resistant to that. And so we do sometimes have to navigate these complex kind of relationships and really just remember and understand that these are oftentimes children and adolescents, and we need to have their best interest at heart and really prioritize their long-term health, because at the end of the day, children's dance or youth dance or whatever we want to call it is not that serious. It should be fun. And obviously I've made a career of working within the dance world, and I'm very passionate about the dance world. But at the end of the day, your kid's dance competition is not going to make or break their dance career or their life or anything like that. But it does have the potential to have long-term health consequences. So we really want to make sure that we are making good decisions on behalf of these young dancers, because they're just not capable of making those decisions on their own, regardless of how mature they might seem. So I just want to throw that in there as well, because I know there's been, like I said, a lot of media and a lot of armchair experts kind of weighing in on the Lindsey Vonn Olympics thing. But it is a different situation when you have an adult who is a professional who has worked in that field and performed at that level for dozens of years, versus when we are dealing with a child or an adolescent and they are really looking to us to be the experts. So that, I think, is all I have to say on this topic. I would love to hear your thoughts in terms of whether people have other things that they would add to. Like I said, it's not necessarily an exhaustive list, but these are the things that sort of play into our minds when we are deciding whether it is or is not appropriate for a dancer to be performing when they are dealing with an injury. All right, I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to go back and watch some more Olympics. If you have any questions, though, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you so much for listening today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.